The moment a queen lost a war against Rome, the world did not simply change around her, it collapsed inward, violently and irreversibly, because Roman victory was not designed to end resistance, but to erase identity, and the instant her city gates fell, her crown ceased to exist, replaced not by mercy or negotiation, but by silence, chains, and a law that declared her no longer a person at all. Rome did not see defeated rulers as enemies, to be respected, or rivals to be spared. It saw them as objects, trophies of domination, proof that the empire's will had crushed yet another world beneath its boots. Under Roman law, a captured foreign ruler lost every legal protection instantly. Gender offered no shield. Royal blood offered no immunity. A queen who once commanded armies and addressed thousands now legally became res, a thing, property of the Roman state, to be used, displayed, or destroyed at will. This legal erasure was the first act of violence, quieter than the battlefield, but far more enduring, because it stripped away the future before the body was ever touched. Rome understood something that many empires would later imitate. If you destroy the symbol, the people lose hope, and queens were symbols. They were living embodiments of sovereignty, continuity, and defiance. Breaking them publicly was not revenge. It was strategy. The Roman triumph was the empire's most refined weapon. On the surface, it looked like celebration. Marble streets lined with flowers, incense thick in the air, crowds roaring in approval as victorious generals rode through the city like demigods. But beneath the pageantry lay something colder and far more deliberate. Triumphs were psychological warfare staged on a continental scale. Every detail was choreographed. Every captive was placed with intention. Every humiliation was designed to echo far beyond the city walls, carried by rumor, memory, and fear back to the provinces still breathing under Roman rule. At the center of this spectacle stood the defeated rulers, dragged from the shadows of history into blinding daylight, forced to walk while Rome watched, judged, and learned what resistance cost. For queens, this humiliation carried a sharper edge, because Rome despised the very idea of female sovereignty. A woman who ruled men, who commanded armies, who defied Rome's patriarchal order, was not merely an enemy. She was an insult that demanded correction. Zenobia of Palmyra understood this better than anyone. Once, she had ruled an empire that stretched across Syria, Egypt, and much of the eastern Mediterranean, a queen who spoke multiple languages, rode with soldiers, and openly challenged Roman authority. For a brief, dangerous moment, she made Rome afraid. That was her true crime. When she was finally captured, Rome did not rush to kill her. That would have been too simple. Instead, they chose something far more effective. She was dressed in her finest royal garments, gold woven into her clothing, jewels placed deliberately at her throat and wrists, and then they chained her. Not iron chains meant for prisoners, but chains of gold, heavy enough to exhaust her with every step, bright enough to gleam beneath the Roman sun. This was not mercy. It was theater. Rome wanted the crowd to see her wealth transformed into weight, her power into burden, her magnificence into spectacle. Every step she took through Rome's streets told a story without words. This is what happens to those who rise too high. The crowd cheered. They always did. Triumphs taught ordinary Romans where they stood in the world, above the conquered, protected by the empire, fed by its violence. Children watched queens walk in chains and learned the lesson early. Resistance is futile. Power belongs to Rome. Even royalty kneels. Yet Zenobia lived, and that survival has often been mistaken for kindness, for restraint, for some rare spark of Roman mercy. But survival, in her case, was simply another layer of punishment. She was spared execution so she could be displayed, discussed, remembered not as a ruler, but as a warning. Rome allowed her to live under watch, stripped of authority, surrounded by luxury that functioned as a gilded cage. Her existence became propaganda, a living monument to Roman dominance. Her continued breathing served the empire better than her death ever could. But Zenobia's story was the polished version, the one Rome allowed history to remember because it could be framed as magnanimous. For most queens, the path after the triumph led somewhere far darker. The triumph was not the end, it was the prelude. Once the cheers faded and the streets were washed clean, captives were quietly removed from public view. Kings and queens were taken beneath the city, into places tourists would never see, into stone corridors beneath Rome itself, where light barely reached and time lost meaning. The Mamertine prison waited there, damp, airless, carved deep into the earth. No windows, no ceremony, no witnesses. This was where Rome finished what it began in the streets. The purpose of the triumph was to humiliate. The purpose of the prison was to erase. Here, former rulers starved in darkness. Some were strangled. Some were left to die slowly. Their bodies were disposed of, without markers, without names, without memory. Rome celebrated their conquest above ground, while their victims vanished below it, ensuring that the final image carried by the public was glory, not suffering. This system was not accidental, it was refined over centuries. Rome understood that fear worked best when wrapped in ritual, when cruelty was normalized through law, when violence became tradition rather than outrage. Queens were ideal targets because their fall sent a message across generations. If even royalty could be reduced to chains and silence, what chance did anyone else have? And yet, for all its precision, Rome's machine carried a flaw it never fully acknowledged. Humiliation does not always produce submission. Sometimes it produces rage, sometimes it produces rebellion, and sometimes, when a queen is broken publicly, her people do not forget. They remember, they wait, they sharpen their anger. The empire mistook silence for acceptance. It mistook spectacle for control, and in doing so, it planted the seeds of uprisings that would burn cities, slaughter legions, and haunt Roman memory long after the triumphal arches began to crumble. Because when Rome turned crowns into chains, it did not merely conquer territories, it transformed bodies into battlegrounds, dignity into currency, and human lives into lessons written in blood and gold. And the next chapter of this story would reveal what happened when one queen refused to let that lesson stand unchallenged, when humiliation ignited fury instead of fear, and when Rome discovered that terror, once unleashed, does not always obey the hand that wields it. Rome's cruelty did not end when the triumphal music faded, because spectacle was only the opening act, and what followed was far more intimate, far more deliberate, and far more devastating, as the empire shifted its focus from breaking symbols to breaking flesh, turning the human body itself into a battlefield where power was asserted not through banners or law, but through pain, violation, and absolute control. If chapter 1 revealed how Rome destroyed queens in public, then this chapter descends into the private spaces where terror became personal, where humiliation was no longer theatrical, but surgical, designed to scar not only the victim, but the memory of entire peoples. For Rome, violence against defeated queens was never random. It was instructional. Every act carried a message. Every wound was meant to be understood. No story reveals this more brutally than that of Boudica, queen of the Iceni, whose fate exposes the raw mechanics of Roman domination when law and ceremony gave way to naked force. Boudica was not captured in chains and paraded through Rome. Her punishment was inflicted closer to home, in front of her people, and that difference mattered, because Rome understood that terror works best when it is witnessed by those who still have something to lose. When Roman officials seized Boudica, they did not execute her. They did something far worse. They flogged her publicly, Then they raped her daughters in front of her eyes. This was not battlefield excess. It was policy. By assaulting her daughters, Rome attacked lineage. By violating them publicly, Rome attacked memory. By forcing Boudica to watch, Rome attacked the last refuge of any ruler, dignity. The message was unmistakable. Resistance would not be answered with honorable death. It would be answered with annihilation of the self, of family, of future. Rome believed this act would end rebellion forever. Instead, it ignited one of the bloodiest uprisings the empire ever faced. What Rome failed to understand was that humiliation does not always collapse the spirit. Sometimes it sharpens it. Sometimes it transforms grief into fury so absolute that fear evaporates entirely. Boudica did not disappear into silence. She became something Rome could not control. She rallied tribes. She spoke not of strategy, but of vengeance. She framed the rebellion not as a political revolt, but as a moral reckoning. And tens of thousands answered her call, burning Roman cities to the ground, slaughtering colonists, and turning the empire's cruelty back upon itself. This is the paradox at the heart of Roman domination. The same psychological terror that subdued some provinces radicalized others. The same acts meant to erase identity sometimes forged it into something unbreakable. Rome ruled through fear, but fear is volatile. It does not always obey. Yet for every Boudica who rose in flames, there were countless queens whose stories never reached rebellion, whose bodies absorbed the violence quietly, whose suffering ended not in revolt, but in erasure. These women vanished into prisons, into households, into obscurity, stripped of names, and reduced to instruments of Roman pleasure or punishment. The body became Rome's final argument. Sexual violence was one of the empire's most effective tools because it required no explanation. It crossed language barriers. It shattered social structures instantly. A queen violated was not merely harmed. She was symbolically dethroned. In patriarchal societies, rape was not seen as an injury to the woman alone, but as a stain upon her entire people, a calculated assault on collective honor. Rome exploited this mercilessly, understanding that shame could travel faster than legions. And when bodies were no longer useful, when humiliation had been extracted to its fullest extent, Rome disposed of its captives with chilling efficiency. This is where the Mamertine prison returns to the story, not as an abstract endpoint, but as a living tomb beneath the empire's heart. Deep below Rome's streets, former kings and queens were lowered into darkness, sometimes left to starve, sometimes strangled in silence, their deaths unrecorded, their bodies discarded without ceremony. The triumph ended above ground. The reckoning happened below. The Roman public rarely saw this part. That was intentional. The empire wanted its citizens to remember victory, not the mechanics of cruelty that sustained it. The crowds remembered gold chains, cheering generals, divine favor. They did not see the rotting walls, the damp stone, the stench of decay where conquered rulers breathed their final breaths alone. Rome curated memory as carefully as it curated violence. But violence leaves residue. It lingers in rumor. It survives in rebellion. It echoes in the stories told by the conquered long after monuments crumble. The fate of defeated queens reveals something deeply uncomfortable about Rome's legacy. The empire did not merely conquer territory, it colonized the human psyche. It taught the world that power could be maintained through ritualized cruelty, that law could be weaponized, that spectacle could disguise atrocity, and that bodies could be used as messages written in pain. This blueprint outlived Rome itself. Centuries later, empires would repeat these patterns with frightening familiarity, parading defeated leaders, violating the vulnerable, erasing inconvenient truths, and calling it order, justice, or civilization. Rome did not invent tyranny, but it perfected its presentation. And yet, despite everything, the stories of these queens persist, fractured but alive, because terror does not always silence history. Sometimes it amplifies it. Zenobia's chains still gleam in the imagination. Boudica's fury still burns in memory. The unnamed queens who vanished beneath Rome, S streets, still haunt the foundations of an empire that claimed eternity but could not escape the consequences of its own brutality. This is the final irony. Rome believed domination would secure immortality. Instead, it ensured remembrance of its cruelty alongside its greatness. The bodies of queens were meant to be warnings, but they became testimonies. Testimonies that power without restraint corrodes from within. Testimonies that humiliation breeds resistance. Testimonies that no empire, no matter how vast, can fully control how its violence will be remembered. Because when Rome turned the body into a battlefield, it did more than win wars. It exposed the cost of empire in flesh and blood. And that cost, once seen clearly, can never be unseen.